Good morning. This is Gaming Perspectives with
Saul
and Jolene. And today we're talking about how RPGs have changed from the 70s until today. That's the 1970s for those of you who didn't know.
Yeah, I had titled it the old RPGs, but Jolene didn't like that, the title. But, I played original D&D, so that's where I started. Yes, I think when you compare old first generation RPGs to today's RPGs, you definitely see some trends that are different or ideas that are different.
This would be the third generation of RPGs.
I think so.
Because if you go with a generation is around 20 years.
I would say, yeah, you're right. I think there is that middle generation, the 90s, that we don't talk about.
That's not true.
The stepchild. No, seriously, but I think you're right. We would be remiss if we don't mention RPGs in the 70s. I think the most influential RPG in the 70s was probably Vampire the Masquerade.
In the 70s?
I'm sorry, in the 90s.
Thank you.
So I would say D&D and everything created around the 70s.
All the stuff he
all the way
usually talks
to the
about.
80s. And in the 90s, Vampire the Masquerade really was influential to a lot of gamers.
Well, yeah.
And
that was a lot of their first game.
Or it may not have been the first game, but it was one that they really liked and they played a lot.
I've heard a lot of kids.
Really? That was the first?
Well, I've heard a lot of people say that in the 90s, that was their first game.
Wow. That's kind of interesting.
Did Werewolf?
Yeah, that's all the line.
All that genre, right?
Right. So
we missed that.
Vampire the Masquerade.
Because Saul doesn't like vampires.
I don't like horror usually.
Well, you're getting a little bit more accustomed to it these days.
Well, I have one group that absolutely loves Call of Cthulhu, which is a horror game. And because they like Call of Cthulhu, they also like other horror games, right? What was that one about the
Lindworm?
Yes, the Campaway one. Oh my God. That was a horror game. We just played a session of Never Going Home, a World War II horror game.
Was it World War II? I thought it was World War I.
You are correct. It was World War I in trench warfare. I get my wars confused.
He shouldn't, but he does.
I do. I've been actually reading extensively. Well, not lately, but up until the pandemic, I was reading quite a bit about World War I, and a lot of people are considering it the forgotten war because I don't think there's anybody.
Nobody talks about it, and everybody's dead.
Everybody's dead, right? So I don't think there's anybody who was alive during World War II.
World War I.
World War I, sorry. And we're losing people from World War II, right?
Yes.
And not that anybody's going to forget World War II, but I think because World War II had such a huge impact on the world, it overshadows World War I.
It was really just a continuation of World War I, but
we'll get over into that. But yes. This is not a podcast about World War or history. This is a podcast. What is this podcast about? RPGs. That's right. We're talking about older RPGs. So for the first RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons, original Dungeons and Dragons, AD&D, even
Traveler
is a big one. Even other games from the 80s like Iron Crown Industries, their set of rules. If
he missed the game that you love from that era, don't worry. It's just because there's a lot of them.
Publishers like FGU, which published Space Opera, a bunch of other games, Gangster, Pirates or something like that.
Gamma World came out in the early 80s too.
Oh, Gamma World was by TSR, right? So it actually came out in the 80s, I think.
81.
81? I thought it was earlier than that. But there's those games, and they were very groundbreaking. This idea of role playing by a certain set of rules and stuff was amazing. Not whoever, but Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax. I don't know if it would have still happened, this idea of role playing, but I don't know when it would have happened. I'm just glad that Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax were the ones that did it, because in my youth, I was able to start playing role playing games, and here I am, not as a youth, still playing role playing games. So I think we could say some generalities about those role playing games in the late 70s, early 80s. I think it'll fit. Of course, not anytime you make generalities, there's always going to be outliers. There's always going to be something that bucks the trend. But for the most part, they're pretty much true, right? That these generalities
That's
exist.
why it's called a generality.
Right. So for me, elements of an old game I think you probably agree with me, Jolene. Rules, lots of rules,
and tables,
and charts. Now, Jolene didn't play some games that had a lot of charts. Like D&D had some charts, right? I had the hit table.
I think with the D&D I played in the 80s with my brother, it must have been AD&D.
Yeah.
Because, and then I was playing with 11-year-old boys, so they might have adjusted the rules. I don't know.
Right. So there was a lot of rules. There's a lot of rules in those days were broken down into charts. Probably one of the.
I think it comes from the fact that it comes from miniatures.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of charts and rulers involved in miniatures.
Yes. So I think the charts were a way of breaking down information to make it easier for people to understand.
Yeah.
So I think one game, Iron Crown Industries, I mentioned earlier, did Claw Law, Spell Law. I think it was Spell Law, Claw Law, Arms Law. So you would have to buy 3 different books. Claw Law was like hand to hand and melee weapons.
That has stayed. Most games have 3 books, right? They have the monster manual, the DM guide, and the player's handbook.
That's true. Well, that was D&D.
I know. I totally. I was just thinking because you said old versus new, and I'm thinking for most of them, except for the one sheet rules,
Yes, I think you're right. So, yeah, I didn't think about that, but what's weird about Iron Crown Industries, which they shortened to ICE. Iron Crown Industries.
That's not a good term to use these
ICE.
days.
Well, yeah, depending on what it was,
who
a
you
drug
are,
or the people rounding up people. It was weird because you would have to, if you wanted to fight with weapons, you had to have arms law, and if you wanted to fight with
magic,
those spell law, right?
Yeah.
And then if you wanted hand to hand, like literally hand to hand, you had claw law. So it was kind of interesting. I never bought that book, but one of my friends years later, he tried to get a game of Middle Earth role playing, which used a version of those rules, the Iron Crown Industries. It was made by Iron Crown Industries, and it was chart after chart. Like every weapon had its own chart, a whole page.
Well, there's a lot of weapons, and if you're going to do that, you're going to need that.
And then there was like the weird thing about it, and that's people still love this chart, was a critical hit chart, or critical damage or critical failure rolls and stuff like that.
Well, Space Opera had those charts of.
Yeah, but it wasn't like that. It wasn't. I mean, I understand that they have a lot of charts.
No, they had charts when you hit. It was where you rolled to see where you hit, right?
Yeah. But
so that was. I think that, and I don't. Saul's not making fun of this stuff. I think in the best sense of the way he's explaining it, to explain that this is what has come along to make role playing the way it is now.
Yes.
Because of those first endeavors with all the charts and stuff like that.
Well, I think it had to do with people are just trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
And see what works and what doesn't work. I mean,
and I'm glad they did. I'm glad they did all of that, because role playing now is a lot more fun than with a lot of charts for me. But if they wouldn't have went to all that trouble to make those, I would say spreadsheets, but I don't know what was back then. To make,
I'm sure there's spreadsheets back then.
Yeah, spreadsheets and figure out all of these rules and how to do it, then we wouldn't have the industry and hobby that we have today.
Right. I mean, yeah, you're right. It was a lot of trial and error. And actually, I think Iron Crown Industries did pretty well for a bit of time. Like I said, they were able to get a hold of the token license, and they made MERP, Middle Earth Role Playing, and I used that, and I actually played a little bit. I made a character, and it was interesting. Later on, they came out with Space Master, which was a version of the rules for science fiction. I used their supplements for Space Opera because they were just like settings and stuff. The whole idea of the space station, I took from a supplement called Acacia Station, which is, I just took the whole name. I think I made the station much bigger because in the Space Master rules, it was like a research station. So I wanted something bigger like Babylon 5. So it was more like a diplomatic type of place. So I made it bigger so it would hold like 5 to 10,000 people or something like that.
More people.
Anyway, so they had, very nice set of rules. I mean, in the sense that they were very well made. They had lots of supplements, lots of adventures. So it was relatively popular. They were relatively successful. Another thing about elements of an old game is they try to be simulationists, like I said. They tendency to be adversarial, which for me would be a problem, right? You don't want adversarial relationship between the GM and the players. Like they say D&D was adversarial, and I guess there's adversarial GMs that exist today still, which I don't see how fun that would be unless you are really...
I think the idea of that comes from the fact that, GMs get attached to the things that they create, right? The storylines and the monsters or bad guys, right? Because they take time to put those out. So I think the adversarial part, and especially how deadly like D&D can be when you're trying to check for traps and all kinds of things like that. In the beginning, that was a big deal. And a lot of people still use those, but a lot of people don't.
Well, there was the roll versus death, right? There was always that problem where it just, whether your character lived or died, depend on one roll.
Right.
Well, you made your saving throw. Okay, that's how I died. One of my first most powerful characters was a wizard, I think, and I thought it was pretty badass. And I came across like 3 priests, and one of them did the ray of death, and I rolled my die.
Does that spell exist anymore?
I don't think so.
See,
I think there's a ray of disintegration or something like that.
Yeah,
that probably is comparable to the ray of death. So I rolled, and it was real tough, and I had rolled the wax D20, and
it didn't work.
Didn't work. I rolled a 3, killed over, dead. That was all there was to it.
I guess, but that didn't have anything with the GM being adversarial.
Yeah, he wanted to kill my character, obviously. Felipe.
Well, so I guess it's the way that each player takes it, right?
I cried for hours after that of my 11-year-old self. Another thing about older games is that sometimes they're railroady. There's multiple reasons for that. I think modules back in the day were railroady, and they were used as a example of how adventure should go. So people who bought those modules go, oh, that's the way you play. That's how you build an adventure. That's how you play D&D. I think luckily for us, me and my brother and my friends, we didn't have a hobby store nearby us at the closest one.
And Felipe has a great imagination.
Well, there's that. He does have a good imagination. And we were poor, right? We didn't have a lot of disposable income. And so going to a hobby store, one, is not available. And two, buying something, whether it was $13, $14, was just like too much money. So he was all left to his own to come up with ideas and campaign ideas and adventure ideas. And when you're given that kind of freedom, you come up with whatever you want. It's not going to be like a module, at least for the most part.
Modules are hard to run, as far as I'm concerned, because the players aren't going to go and do what it says that they're supposed to do. Right,
that's the big problem. And then I think, unless it's a dungeon, a straightforward dungeon, right? The arrow's telling you which way to go. Yeah.
It's a shiny arrow too. It's on
bright.
The wall.
It's luminescent, so even if they can't see it, it glows. I think in that sense, the only decision you have is whether you want to open a door or not, theoretically.
And you want to open all the doors, right?
Well,
so you can get all the treasure.
There was a lot of times when you would listen at a door. Actually, it was a roll. You listen at doors, and you would listen at the door, and then depending on what you rolled, you would hear something, and then you're like, not that this ever happened, where our group decided, that sounds too nasty. We just prepared ourselves to meet our doom.
Meet our doom.
Meet our doom, depending on how loud you hear a rustling of scales, and it rattles the ground.
Well, scales is kind of a giveaway.
You rattle the ground. I'm like, okay, you're on point, Bill.
You go first.
So railroady games, we all talk about it, and it's almost a trope, right? It's almost this trope about older games being trope railroady.
Yeah.
And of course, limited player agency. Now, because Felipe, my brother, who ran the games when I was younger, he didn't have modules to go off as an example. He just made a world, like a breathing world based on the fantasy novels that he read at the time, and we had a lot of player agency. We went wherever we wanted to. We chased clues. Oh, we hear about this, or people would ask us if we want to go do this, and we're like, sure. For us, that was player agency. It wasn't like we got stuck going into a dungeon, and that's all we did for 10 years. I mean,
I was just playing a game, not last night, but the night before with Felipe, and he gives you total player agency. Of course, we're playing an investigative game, and we keep showing up at the houses after the people have been killed. So we're not very good investigators, apparently, but it was a lot of fun to try to get there before the death happened.
I would say we're very good investigators at investigating murder scenes.
We're just very bad at
can't prevent them
catching the murderer. But no, he still uses, and he was using a module for this one.
It sure looks like it. I have no idea where he got that module.
He said it was a module, or he said it was a adventure.
Yeah.
So I know he was using it, but he, lets you do whatever you want, and then he just tells you he went with what the story was, right?
It was really, you did a really good job.
So doing a module for him is the same way probably as he would have, since he's always run it a certain way, right? He allows for the player agency even within the module.
Right. I think he does what I do, and I probably learned it from him, I guess.
Obviously.
When we did get a module, I think the first module was bought by me, Sip, and Esteban, and we bought Against the Giants, which was a culmination of, I don't know the numbers. Modules back then had a numbering system like B1, B2, right. B3, right? T1, T1, T2, T3. I forget which one it was. But it was against the Hill Giants, against the Frost Giants, and against the Fire Giants. And what they did is they combined all those modules into Against the Giants, and then we go, whoa, what a deal. And I don't remember where we even bought it, but I remember it was a green, had the back was a hard cover, no, not hard, but hard cardboard, and inside was a booklet. And they had pictures on the, like you could use it as a
GM screen.
Correct. And we each took one. Like, I forget who ran what. But I took one, Sip took one, and I don't know if Esteban actually ever ran one. But he was supposed to, but I think one of us ran two. Esty was not interested in GMing. But anyway, we did the module, and I don't remember it being that railroady, but I guess it didn't matter. It was like, oh, I think that was our first module. I don't remember my brother ever buying a previous one. He did buy the Village of Hamlet. That's right. He did buy that one. And that one is a weird module. That's more like a setting. And I don't think we've ever played it because he worked on it for a long time, making maps, adding characters, and it just never got off the ground because he was in the planning stages of it because there was so much work to do because you really couldn't run that module as as an adventure because it was more like a setting. Oh, this character does this character's doing that. There's some evil plot, but I've never
It's like the big books now, the Giant King one, the
Storm King's Thunder. That one's kind of railroady. You go from place to place. But as I remember this one game from Top Secret. The Top Secret, when you bought the first edition box game, it gave you an adventure in a book called Operation Speciality, something Italian. And all it was a setting. It was like a little part of a city. And this non-player character was involved with this, and this non-player was, but you weren't sent on a mission to do anything. So with this setting, you were supposed to come up with something and then have the players do something in that setting. But there was no, at least as in my 12-year-old brain or 13-year-old brain, I couldn't figure out if there was I never ran that adventure. Later on, there was an Operation Fast Pass, which was more of an adventure, a
module adventure.
Right.
Well, there's a difference between a setting and a module, right?
Right. It seemed just like a location with interesting people.
Right.
And so
to give you ideas of what to do with your game.
Right. Or what to, yeah.
So obviously the older games also had non-railroady things as in settings.
Yeah, but I don't think it was intentional. I think it was just like lazy.
I don't know that you can say that.
Lazy creation or something. Or maybe, like I said, it was something they didn't really know how to do. It was like, what is it? It's a brand new thing that they were doing. And I heard somewhere, I forget where it was, probably another podcast, they were saying that TSR, the makers of Dungeons and Dragons and Top Secret and Game World, they at the very beginning of the company, they didn't think about modules. They didn't think there was money to be made in modules. They thought we'll just sell the rules and people will come up with their own stuff. But modules became really, really popular.
Well, it's because it's hard to come up with your own adventure at first as a GM, right? You want something to inspire you, and those modules give you ideas. And then if you get into running them, then you just want another module to run, so you don't have to come up with the idea yourself.
So I think that's what my brother did, and I take that from him too, is that you get a module just for inspiration.
Right.
Whether you use it as intended.
Like some of them have maps and stuff like that, right? Which is really cool.
Yeah.
And
we talked about using modules and making up your own. But I think you're right. I think but the way my brother does it is that he just gets inspiration from the module. And as do I, because sometimes I can't think of something. Like, man, I'm just a writer's block, mental block, whatever. I get an adventure and I'm like, oh yeah, I don't like that part. I'll take that. Oh, I changed this. So it's almost not recognizable, but it's more like I'm just.
But you did use
an outline of it. Yes, yeah, it was functional, right? Yeah. It helped me out. So we're talking about limited player agency in the old game. So what is different between then and now? Modern games. I think there's a few things that have changed. One is
the time from the 70s to now. A lot of things have changed.
Well, I think that there's been new new ideas have came up in role playing, and for me, elements of the newer games, and then, again, these are just generalities, and not saying that this didn't happen in the 70s or 80s or 90s, but today most games, it seems like new games they're more collaborative. Mm-hmm. They want input from the players, and the GM are telling a story. This idea that you're telling a story.
It's evolved in a lot of ways in that direction.
Right. A lot of games today are non-murder hobo-ish, if that's a term.
There's different styles of games. Instead of just going on an adventure, you could be doing an investigation. Although you did those in like Top Secret and stuff, right?
Yes. Even fantasy games, the idea of being a murder hobo.
I don't know that that's actually an idea. I think that just happens.
You're right. But I think certain rules kind of not push you.
Well, if you're going into a dungeon to get treasure, that kind of inspires murder hobo-ishness, right?
Yes, exactly.
Versus if you go to a town and somebody's hiring you to, there's a bunch of wolves or something attacking the farmers, then you got to figure out what's going on, right?
Yes. Because it's more collaborative, there's a higher player agency. Players can add more to the story, do more, be more open-ended to what is possible.
I think that in both of those examples, especially player agency and your idea of non-murder hobo-ish games, more storytelling games, I think it has to do with the evolution of the gaming industry and the way that people play. But also, I think it is a kind of a psychological things have been brought into it, such as do you remember in the 80s with the, what did they call it, I grew up going to church, so when we were at church all of a sudden, I think it was 82 or 83, they said you shouldn't play this Dungeons and Dragons thing. It's
Satanic Panic.
Yes. But unfortunately for our church, that didn't really take off because the pastor's son was my GM at the time. So we kind of just, his dad and my mom went, whatever.
So the pastor's son,
yes,
was okay with you guys playing D&D.
The pastor was okay with it. We played it in his house.
Right. Okay, playing D&D.
Yes.
The Satan game.
He didn't consider it the Satan game.
But what's weird is that I was prime timetable wise in the Satanic Panic. I remember the story about that guy who they made Mazes and Monsters. They wrote a book about him. He was on drugs. He had
issues.
He had big time issues, and he played D&D. And it's like, well, all D&D killed him. That's why he died. Why he killed himself. It had nothing to do with that, but it didn't matter. The real story didn't matter. What mattered was that there was a sensationalized story about D&D and Satanism.
It was at the same time when they were talking about backmasking on records.
I think that probably was a little bit earlier, but after that there was metal music causing people to kill themselves. That was later in the 80s, late 80s. But you're right, in the earlier 80s and in the mid 80s, the satanic panic was happening, and it did not affect us at all, which was weird. I mean,
it didn't affect us, and we lived in a small town in the mountains in California,
right?
And we played D&D at the pastor's house, so he knew that that this was ridiculous, right? Because he was, you know what I mean? Because we were playing at the kitchen table.
Yeah. Well, that's where we played.
And the pastor's wife was making dinner, and he was there reading the newspaper, and every once in a while he would give us ideas. And it wasn't it was an adventure game, right?
Yeah.
We were playing.
What's funny is that I remember, this has been discussed, we've discussed the satanic panic before. It was weird is because I grew up in this little town,
Salinas.
It's not a little, I guess it is, I don't know, depends on what you mean by little.
Then.
It was a smaller city, Salinas, and we didn't attend church, right? There's a reason why we didn't attend church, but my fault. But yes, my family was very happy about that. Anyway, so we didn't go to church, so that wasn't a big influence on us. And I don't remember it being a big issue in Salinas at all.
Well, Salinas was a little behind times sometimes.
Well, there's that, but it was also a very conservative town, which I didn't realize until I was much older that it was a conservative town. I mean, for example, my brother started at the Steinbeck Library, which is the main library in Salinas, the Castles and Crusaders Club, and that ran. I remember.
And that ran during that time,
right? I mean, it was after I had graduated from middle school, from junior high, because we didn't go to middle school, so which was 7th and 8th grade. So I was about 13, 14. So it was around 1981, 82. He started that club, and it went through all the way to at least a 10 years that the club was in existence. I know we moved it. He went to a different one for some reason. I don't know why he wanted to move the club, or it stopped being a club, but he wanted to move it to the not San Lucia, but there was one way out there, which was a nice library, but it was too far for us to
It
go.
probably had a bigger space.
It had an interesting space. It was like an octagon. But anyway, like nobody balked at there being a Dungeons and Dragons club. It was called
because most people are not insane. I'm just saying.
Well, we didn't call it the Dungeons and Dragons club. We called it Castles and Crusaders Club, and then some people would go, "What's this about?" And I guess we were cognizant of the situation, but we would say, "Oh, it's it's like a war game," because that was like the easiest thing to explain it as. And then we talked about role playing. And some people would look at it as funny and then walk away. But never did somebody say, "Oh, you guys are doing the devil's work," or whatever. Anything like that. And it was really strange. Considering it was a conservative town, considering, we were a bunch of kids playing and adults like, "Oh, yeah, no problem." It was just really strange. So Satanic Panic just kind of overlooked the little town of Salinas.
Well, I think it overlooked most role players, except for those poor kids that their parents were like, "I read about this and you're not doing that anymore." And we had somebody on one of our episodes, and I can't remember who it was, whose parents are like that, and said he couldn't play, but it was okay because his best friend was, I think it was his best friend's family, like, played anyway, and he got to play with them.
Oh, at their house.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you hear stories that there were book burnings, and their parents threw all their D&D books away, and
so that could have adjusted the way people played, if they were influenced or had a problem with that at that time. Right. But I think the 80s, there were a lot of different games came out, right? Wasn't the one with I want to say Johnny Mnemonic. What's that?
Oh,
game?
Cyberpunk. 1988, I believe.
Yeah. So all kinds of different kinds of things came out, right?
Right. And I was actually going to talk about Cyberpunk, because even in the 80s, even in earlier, this era of what I called older RPGs, that they were non-collaborative, that they were this and that, there were some games that broke those molds, right? For example, I was talking about Bunnies and Burrows, the last episode, and it was where you played rabbits. You weren't even heroic rabbits. You didn't carry swords and stuff. You were just a rabbit. right? Or a bunny. You want to look at bunnies and bros. And that would force you to play a different way than a Dungeons and Dragons game.
Right, because you're not you could be a rabbit fighter, but you may not be as strong as the dog.
Right. Or a fox or anything else out there that can kill you
You're a
and
cute
eat
little
you.
bunny.
Right. And so it really bucked the trend, right? And what's so funny is that we were talking about that game and people thought that it was kind of like, is that real? Is that a real role-playing game? That was like the reaction back then. When my brother brought it home and when after he bought it, we're like, oh yeah, let's try it. It was like no big deal. But obviously there was other people who thought it was a joke, that they were making fun of Dungeons and Dragons, and that was not the case. The guy just had read Watership Down, thought it was an interesting idea, and well, we could make a role-playing game out of it. And so that's what he did. So I was going to talk about Cyberpunk because Cyberpunk, it's this like this new genre that just was born in the mid 80s. And
out of sci-fi novels and
right,
sci-fi ideas.
I originally, when we talked about Cyberpunk before, I originally thought that Mike Pondsmith is the creator of Cyberpunk. He had read the book Neuromancer, but actually he read a book called Hardwired, which was by a different author. They're only a year apart. Neuromancer came out in 1984. The other game came out the other book came out in 1985, and he came out with the rules in 1988. So I forget who the author of that book is. Shoot, I should have looked it up. But supposedly Mike Pondsmith and this author talked about the game, and I think they even played. The author played like the alpha version or the homebrew version of Cyberpunk. What was different about that is that you are a hero, but you're fighting the man, the corporation.
Sounds like dark conspiracy in a different time, right?
And it was very Cyberpunk is very anti-hero in a certain sense.
Well, if you think about the 80s when it was made and those kind of books, that was also the time of the
Goths?
Yes.
Well, they were what do you call it?
Anti-establishment.
Anti-establishment, going with the flow.
Alternative.
An alternative. And punk itself, which started in the 70s, but
well, in the 80s, we were in the United States, in California, we were living under Ronald Reagan, right?
Very repressed.
We were very preppy, and I wasn't, but the cool kids were. And
you're right. I think role-playing games are kind of a reflection of society in a certain sense. But anyway, I think, well, back to Cyberpunk, it was very interesting because there was a tagline called, it said something like, it doesn't matter what you do as long as you look good doing it. It was this idea that
was an 80s thing.
That was an 80s thing, yeah. And it was very interesting, and it was very anti-normal.
Anti-establishment.
Anti-normal or role-playing game, right? You think the end result, most likely, well, you weren't going to get the change that you wanted, right? Because this fight against corporation, this fight against the man was kind of like a fight that was just, you're not going to win. Like this, what do you call it? This unattainable goal. Cyberpunk was a very influential game in the late 80s, in the 90s ushered in those middle games that changed things quite a bit. And that, like I said before, it was Vampire Masquerade.
When did Space Opera? When did Shadowrun come out? 91?
Oh, Shadowrun. I'll have to look that up.
Okay.
But I think it was in the 80s too.
Oh, okay.
Late 80s, obviously. No, it might have been 91. Yeah, you're right. It appears that we're going long on this one, so we might have to do a short follow-up episode.
It may not be short.
We mainly dealt with 1980s games and older games, so in the next episode, part 2, we'll discuss the newer games
from the 90s forward.
From the 90s forward. Actually, we should do there's 3 parts, right? There's new games, old games, the middle years, and then today.
And we'll figure it out.
Correct.
So this is Gaming Perspectives with
Saul
and Jolene.
This has been part 1. You have a good day.